Welcome to the Word for 2021. Today we're in Numbers chapter 31. This chapter and others like it can be difficult to understand. God tells Moses to assemble an army together to go and fight the Midianites and destroy them. So 1,000 men from each tribe are brought together. That's 12,000 men in all make up this fighting force. Phinehas, the priest, also goes along, and he takes with him sacred articles from the sanctuary and the trumpets for signaling. We read in verse 7 that every man was killed in the Midianite cities. Their towns and camps were burned. Balaam also was killed in the fighting. The women and the children were taken as captives. In verse 14, Moses was angry with the men because they spared the women. And he asked, weren't these the ones who seduced the Israelite men to worship false gods at Balaam's advice? The result was that only those that had not been intimate with a man were then allowed to be spared. In verses 48 and 49 we read that Moses later was informed that not one Israelite man from the army was killed in battle. That means there were no casualties on the Israelite side. That's unheard of. That's not common. That is supernatural. We struggle with chapters like this because a whole society is ended. It's difficult to comprehend and we struggle with it because it just seems so unmerciful. But in order to come to grips with this chapter and others like it, we first need to understand God and then understand people. When we think about God, we need to understand that He is extremely merciful. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved for 400 years. But after 400 years, they would come out with great possessions. The fourth generation would come out and they would come back to this very spot. And then he said, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. There was a limit and God was going to use the Israelites to execute His justice. God was patient for 400 years with these people. He wanted them to repent. He wanted them to turn. He wanted them to come to Him, but they never did. Again, He was going to now use Israel as His tool to bring judgment upon them. As we read this chapter, we need to understand that there are limits for how long God will let sin go. Because of man's free will, God gives men and women a choice. They can choose to either do right or to do wrong. But with every choice, there is a consequence. And so sinful choices bring consequences upon the individual and many times upon others as well. If God judged sin immediately, the truth is that none of us would be here. So God is very patient. He is extremely merciful. The people had hundreds of years to turn to God. No one was innocent. In Romans 3:23, we read that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. When two spies went into Jericho, they looked to find out what was taking place. Rahab told the spies that everyone was in fear and dread because the people of Jericho knew that God was not like any other God. He was all-powerful and almighty. They knew about God, but they did not turn in faith to Him. Only Rahab did. Everyone else, even though they knew, they rejected God. The battle was spiritual because not one casualty was seen in the Israelite camp. Again, that's not natural, that is supernatural. In order to understand chapters like this, again, we need to understand who God is and we need to understand people. God is merciful. In man, He has a choice and consequences. Thank you for joining the Word for 2021.